those things.
Good, how about you?
I am ready. 7:01. We'll call to order this March 19th edition of the Woodland Planning Commission. Am I good here? And we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Everybody's got a head start on us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Guess we'll have the clerk take a roll call.
Commissioner Georgioff? Here. Commissioner Simpson?
Here.
Commissioner Watt?
Present?
Commissioner Rabb?
Very good. At this time, we will take citizen communications for items not on the agenda. Bretta, I have nobody on here, but it says mute all, so does that mean it's unmuted?
Click it so it's not, it's blue, it's muted. So just unclick.
There's nobody there.
Just,
I clicked that and I got that.
yes.
Okay. And then turn on the audio. All right. Seeing there's no citizen communication for items not on the agenda, we'll go ahead and move to approve the agenda.
I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
All right, motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That was unanimous. Then we have a consent item to approve the minutes from our February 19th Planning Commission meeting.
I move to approve the February 19th Planning Commission minutes for the meeting.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So, I almost went a little Saturday Night Live on you there. February.
Yeah.
All right. Our accomplishments are many. We'll go ahead and move into workshop on retooling our code and discussing code enforcement, which is really a better title for this. You have a bit of a staff report for us?
I do. For the record, my name is Travis Goddard. I'm Community Development Director for the City of Woodland, for the record. So the attached to the agenda is a handout, and we didn't get a chance to go through this previously, but this is available on our website. Unfortunately, we have made some code changes that are not reflected in this handout, so it refers to old code sections. But it essentially is a flow chart of the code enforcement process. And the code work that was done on the code enforcement was done in 2020 by myself at the time. And this is a representation of that process. The city is driven by outside.
Complaint driven?
Complaint driven, yes, sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. So we do not self-report unless it's a life safety issue that has been identified. And when a complaint comes in, the first thing we try and do is we do education and outreach, and we have some small postcards. And the first postcard that comes out which is, shown by block 3A. There we go. So when we receive a complaint, we reply to the complainant if they ask for it, we let them know. Then we send this postcard, and we have two versions of this postcard. The first one is kind of a friendly, hey, we've received a complaint that you have tall grass in your yard, and there's a code section that you have 2 weeks to address this issue. And then the code enforcement officer will go out and do the inspection, and if they can't verify or if it's been fixed, then the case would be closed because there's no violation. The assumption is that we can get most people just by letting them know that the neighbors had said something. Most people are conscientious enough to take care of that. If not, what we actually do is we would send a second postcard, and the postcard is a little more sternly written in that it says, we have identified a violation on your property. This property, the code section in violation is, then we write the specific code number, and then it says if you have 2 weeks, or we'll give them a time period in which to rectify that problem, otherwise we would take it to the next step. And the next step is really a letter after we do a reinspection, and if the problem still exists, the next option is to go to a notice and order. And the notice and order is laid out in our code, and it's very specific, and it basically lays out what the fine could be, and that's what we're going to talk about later on. But it essentially starts a clock where they could be fined on a daily basis, and for each violation. So if they have tall weeds and junk in their yard, that would be considered 2 violations. So they would get 2 penalties for one for each of those violations. And then the next day, if it still exists, then they would have 4. And the next day it would be 6. And then the next day it would be 8. So basically they keep a building, and if they cut their lawn but they still have junk, then it drops down to 1 violation for each day that they're not in compliance. And when we deliver a notice and order, an applicant has the option to appeal, and they can appeal based upon they don't believe they're in violation, that we cited the wrong code, or that they have permits for whatever they did, and so they can appeal it for a number of reasons. They don't even have to have a legitimate complaint to appeal, but it's their right to have that go to the hearings examiner. And the hearings examiner, which is kind of this off box right here, basically it is a public hearing where they have the opportunity to raise their arguments. The hearings examiner is a third-party attorney who actually lives in Oregon, and he does Washington State and Oregon hearing examiner duties, and his job is essentially, as a licensed attorney, is to take a look at the evidence in the file, whether it's a land use file or an appeal, to determine whether or not staff made an error in the case, regardless of what it is. And he actually does code enforcement, animal control, and land use hearings. So I've known him for 20 years and we've dealt with him for at least 20 years. The after the hearing occurs, theoretically, if he upholds the order, then we are back in the enforcement, and during that time, the penalties keep accruing if they don't take action. If he finds that that there was an error, the applicant has, that there was a code enforcement case, the applicant, the violator has the option to appeal that to county court. So it would be Clark County Court or Cowlitz County Superior Court, depending on where the violation occurred and where their jurisdiction is. But theoretically, it could go up to, all the way up to a court, and then before it gets adjudicated. Ideally, what we're looking for is that case to be closed because they've come into compliance, and we strictly try for that voluntary compliance, and we've gotten that about 90, probably 98% of the time. I can think of 3 cases where we've actually had to assess penalties. So we get success a lot with just our coordination and cooperation. And then if the order is final, what we will do is we will issue like a monthly penalty letter, which basically says your violation has been has another 30 days has accrued, and that your penalty is now X amount of dollars. If you don't pay it within 2 weeks, then we will put a lien against your property. And famously, the example of this was 20 after 4. We would send him a notice every month that says, you've had 30 days of violation, your penalty is $8,250, and if you don't pay it within 2 weeks, we will put a lien against the property. And he would just come in and give us the $8,250, and then next month it would be another bill depending on how long the month is. So we basically never had to go to a lien, so we haven't done a lien since I've been here in the 8 years. But that essentially is the process. We start with 2 postcards, then we go to a letter, then we go to a notice and order, and it would go right to a penalty letter if they don't appeal. So are there any questions about that kind of flow?
I think it's a good start. I kind of question, so this is the same format we're going to use for junk cars in the yard, even though we need the police to tag them? I mean, is there a point in this flow chart where it should fork off into different levels of, different departments of responsibility or something? Because we have enforcement in the building code, the development code, and in health and sanitation and in other parts of our code. And is that proper for that to all be?
You want to answer that?
And I think that's kind of what we're trying to get this dialed in, because this is pretty generic, it's pretty vague, and it is a case-by-case situation, and they are a lot of times all different. And so I think, that's what we're kind of trying to figure out. Like, so this is the template that we have been kind of going by. Let's revise it. Let's
So let's, for everybody, don't get too attached to this flow chart. I think we're gonna need a flow chart, but it's for
the
us
nice thing is like Travis was saying, 98% of the people comply. It's been
Yeah.
a really good response, so we don't even have to really use the flow chart. I'd like to keep it that way, but
So, when I was on the planning commission before in 2015 or 16, the mayor, it was before Will, put together a task force of people to update the code stuff because of a neighbor that had a bad neighbor. And so we worked on it, but I don't know if it all got completed when I had to move on to do other things, but that neighbor still has that bad neighbor. I know he's had that problem yard next door for 10 years. And was it 503 Washington Street? Do they have a file?
Oh,
And have we gone to the point of liens? Because it's been that long, right? I don't know what you can publicly say about any one case, but that case as an example, I'm going to bring up some different examples, but that case as an example, where did we, I know it's not for lack of effort, but where did we hit the wall? Should that have gone to a different department at some point, or?
So that case is literally what has brought us here. And I did reach out to the city attorney, and she looked at our coding and she's like, it's vague. You guys need to reword this. It's not clear enough, because part of us is like, that's PD, and PD's like, we don't want to do that. That's code enforcement. And so that's why we've been kind of stuck on that case, because
Have we been assessing fines?
We are closer to adding them to the list for Make a Difference Day and renting a garbage bin, put it out on
So-
the street so that we could abate it for them.
If we have this flow chart and it says that we go down this flow chart, we haven't even done that for that property. I just, and then, my other example is, the hotel that halfway burned, or whatever it was, over by the doctor's office over there. I know you're not able to get a reply from the landowner, but do we need to have the city attorney write a letter? These are the things, what are the steps past not getting, a reply to the postcard?
And I did reach out to the fire marshal and had him go inspect it, and he said because there's no life safety issues, like, he didn't think he could enforce anything.
We actually, I imagine he can't enforce anything, but we have a blight on the neighborhood portion in our code.
And we also had the building inspector go out there, and he said yes, it is adequately sealed up for that, for the safety concerns, and that he didn't feel that we had enough evidence that would force them to repair that building, and the fact that the majority of that site is maintained in a relatively clean manner. The fact that that building is boarded up, there's several like that around the city, but as long as they maintain the rest of the property, it's pretty hard for us to proactively do an abatement on it.
If, we cite in our code the International Building Maintenance Code,
Mm-hmm.
And it has requirements there to people keep their things in order, things have to be painted, no peeling paint, no rotting wood. And that's the other thing too, is that whole International Building Maintenance Code has a complete penalty. It doesn't have the numbers, but it has process to it in there as well. Bretta, have you seen all that? So we have this, and we cite the code, so actually that stuff kind of goes with it. And I don't know, I know you've had issues with having to have the police tag cars and things, and I just think I would like to, before we have our meeting with City Council in April, I would kind of like to have say, hey, you guys, we've got to kind of reorganize a whole bunch of things here, and that's kind of I came in today thinking that if we could get started building a new bubble map there,
Okay.
and I've said a lot, and I know Whitney's got some things to say.
The only question I had would be, before the initial postcard goes out, it seems like someone should go out to look to see that there's actually an issue, because sometimes we can get complaints that.
She does.
Yeah.
see that.
think
I
it's
noticed
in
it's
the
not
flow
on
chart.
there, and like I
It-
said, I
Yeah.
don't even look at this.
Yeah.
I kind of have my own flow chart. I will never send a postcard out until I go physically actually inspect, because we do
Yeah.
have neighborhood feuds going on that are just making complaints over nothing, so.
Which, I mean, I would just like it to reflect that, so that it
Absolutely.
also backs you, so.
If we had a chalkboard,
Now, the other thing that's not reflected on here is we now have a permitting system, so we don't actually do all of this stuff manually anymore. A lot of it is generated in our system, and emails or prints letters out for us, so they're standardized, and that's not reflected in this. Now, the last thing, before I move on, anybody have anything else, Sharon or Cliff? Any questions?
I'm wondering, why was this brought to the planning commission? What's the ultimate goal?
the ultimate, I brought this to the planning commission. Because, of course, I dealt with a nuisance, a horrible odor for 4 years. And it actually took a new mayor to listen to me, and he followed up, and then they got Brett on board, and it finally got fixed. But it got drug out for 4 years. It was bad. I know. I lost my business. My business improved because the smell was gone. I couldn't do, I couldn't gain customers because it smelled like something died at my facility. So that's what I know that the process has holes in it, for lack of a better word. I think there's Bretta can probably tell you better, but when I brought this up, Bretta was like, "Thank you. We need to fix this. So we need to fix this where it's actually less work on our staff, and it just has some teeth. I don't think we need to make people afraid, but we need people to if we're getting odor complaints or rat complaints or 5 broken down cars in the yard complaints, we can actually get this stuff cleaned up. And it's been a challenge to get some of those things cleaned up.
So are we looking to reinvent the code enforcement process? What are we doing?
I think strengthen it.
I think that's what Bretta feels we need to do. We need to,
We need a better, okay. So why don't somebody put something together and bring that to the planning commission? Because I don't think we can sit up here and redo the code. That's not our job,
that's
as near as I can.
that's most
Our job is to take a look at what's brought to us and decide whether or not that's good for the city of Woodland, and then make that recommendation.
Well, that kind of goes back to when I first joined and I asked how, as commissioners, are we able to bring something forward as well? Which I was told that we could. So if we have a commissioner bringing it forward, then it's no different than
When
a
you bring me a
community
problem,
member.
if you bring me a problem, bring me a solution. Okay, bring me something we can talk about. Don't bring me a problem and have me reinvent the whole thing, because it would be my idea. Bring me a solution that we can talk about.
Well, and part of what we're going to do today is we're going to work through some of the underlying questions that I need to get your opinions on. So we're going to start with how much are the fines? Are the fines too low? Are the fines too high? Then we'll talk about, okay, some of the definitions, like what is a nuisance? And I do have some nuisance sections from different jurisdictions that you might want to take a look at. And part of it is to get your juices going, to give you a background so that you know what you're thinking about. And then once you give me a little direction, I will be able to essentially write something that I think reflects your desire, but I don't want to,
So you're gonna bring us some problems, and then you're gonna bring us some ideas for solutions, right?
Well,
Yep.
we're in a workshop, we're not in an action item,
Yep.
so that's the whole thing, that we're working on the process.
Yep. So right now, we're talking about defining the problem, I think is really what we're kind of doing right now.
So, probably 80% of what we do in the planning commission is create the code or update the code, and that's our jobs. That's what we do. We like in this situation, we're gonna brainstorm things and come up with better ideas, and out of 4 or 5 brains and not one brain, and then we'll tell Travis our wishes and he'll put that together, and then we'll fine tune it. So that's, most of our job here is creating the code or updating the code or making it better. That's kind of always been our job. So go ahead, Travis.
Okay, so the first section that I reference in that cover sheet is for civil infractions, and I want to point out that our code has multiple inconsistencies, because in some sections we refer to civil penalties. So like when you get a speeding ticket, that's an infraction and you get a penalty. That's a fine. In this case, a civil penalty is not like a misdemeanor or a felony. So those are criminal charges instead of civil charges. And I'm pointing that out because there are sections in our code which refer to misdemeanors, which is a criminal crime. And that's part of what we have to try and figure out, how to weave our way through that. So a class 1 civil infraction is the highest level, and it is $250. And we can have some additional statutory assessments as well. But for the land use side that code enforcement deals with, we don't deal with that. So
Is that just while we're there? Is that per day?
per violation, per day.
Per
So if-
violation per day?
So if they have 2 violations, it would be $500 a day.
And is that codified?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
so we'll cover that. So a class 2 infraction is $125, a class 3 is $50, and a class 4 is $25. And our code, for the development code, other than marijuana violations, like retail sales or violating our marijuana ordinance, that by code is $250, but something like no business license, no building permit is counted as a class 4, so it's $25. And part of Dave's frustration is $25 isn't enough to get that guy to spend money to, tens of thousands of dollars to fix the smell for 4 years, because he's not worried about a $25 fine. And then there are other conditions down here, but those are really only if we go to court. So we haven't had to deal with that yet. So we have a couple options. We can recommend, you can recommend to the council that you would like these numbers increased, or you can recommend that certain types of violations maybe be a class 2 or a class 1 or a class 3, rather than classifying them all by default as a class 4 $25 fine. So for example, maybe putting in a fence without a building permit, not that big of a deal. But if you have somebody who's got a yard full of cars and it's, attracting rats and raccoons, that might be something that you want to classify higher on this list so that the fee is more substantial. So, unless you have any thoughts on that right now,
We'll probably come back to it.
okay. Then the second one on the list is, this is section 8. Sorry, let me get back there. So where I'm working off of is this list here. Sorry, it's down here. vegetation failure to remove penalty, so we just covered the civil infraction amounts, vegetation and the fail to remove. This is mostly oriented towards vegetation that is sticking out into the street or over sidewalks. It is not very well defined for addressing people who have massive weeds and that kind of stuff and overgrowth on their property. And this is the requirement of owning and maintaining trees, plants, shrubs, and vegetation in a manner described in accordance with our tree maintenance in the streets and sidewalks above. Is declared to be a public nuisance. Anyone violating the provisions of this chapter by failing to abate such nuisance within the time specified is subject to is guilty of a misdemeanor and shall be punished by a fine of not exceeding $1,000 or by imprisonment in the city jail not to exceed 90 days. So this is an example of a criminal penalty for what should be a civil violation. And we get a lot of this where it comes up, there's $1,000 maximum. So we spend a lot of time bluffing these guys with smelly businesses, because the reality is if push comes to shove, I would only be able to send them a $1,000 bill each month. So, although I could threaten to throw them in jail, but with a big company like that, who exactly do you throw in jail? I don't know. We would have to get the police on board and figure that out. So the criminal aspect of code enforcement is very problematic. So this gets to the other question you were bringing up, and that is each 24-hour period during which such nuisance continues after the notice of abatement, or in our case, the notice and order, has been given shall constitute a separate chargeable violation. In addition, all nuisance violations described herein shall also be actionable as discussed below. And that is the abatement section and the abatement and nuisance section.
11220, the first one you did, anywhere, right?
It does not, because that's a civil penalty section, and this doesn't refer to it because it refers to a misdemeanor and a fine of up to $1,000, but it doesn't say is that $250 a day, 125, or the 50 or the 25.
And we know we can't really do
Yeah.
civil on, can't do sort of jail time on most stuff. So
Well-
we need to align this with chapter 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the first discrepancy right there. And there is another section in the code, I may not have cut it out for today, that says violations of the development code are treated as a class 4. And it doesn't say class 4 civil infraction or misdemeanor, it just says class 4. And that was enough for us to say, okay, this is the only definition we have for a class 4 and what the fine is. So we kind of bridge that gap, but if we ever went to court, it would be questionable as to how that accrues, but as long as it was nothing more than $1,000, we wouldn't get any additional money anyways, so.
We're not out to get money, we're out to
Get compliance.
get compliance.
Yeah.
And we didn't build a jail in this building, correct? So that isn't, that
It's
needs
not
to be
really
removed
possible.
as well.
Yeah.
If we're gonna open up 100 days in a
Yeah.
year.
So, yeah, technically we are contracted with the county jail.
But wouldn't we need to reword that?
If we were trying to throw somebody in jail for vegetation hanging over the street or sidewalk, yes. So, and now, chapter 812 is actually the nuisance ordinance. So, if you don't have any questions about this kind of gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that we're trying to hang our hat on, and which is why we spend a lot of time bluffing and hand-holding and cajoling as opposed to leaning on people and forcing compliance rather than getting cooperative compliance. Okay, so the next section, and this is the nuisance code. And if you want to, we can dive down into this because I have some examples farther down this document. And the definition is a little squishy in itself. A nuisance is a thing, act, occupation, use, cause, keeping, maintaining, permitting, suffering, or allowing, or using the property, or using of property which annoys, injures, endangers the safety, health, comfort, or repose of the public. So Dave was annoyed from the very first time we talked about that case. And so by definition, that is A to a T, but it's kind of hard to prove that it's a violation because Dave is annoyed, right?
Dave couldn't get out of his car and work. Gave me a headache.
The
You
only,
know,
yeah,
But
yeah.
that's a lot of things too. You know, think annoys, injures, endangers, interferes with or obstructs or tends to obstruct. And then, you know, just even think about insecure in life or use of their property. People, to think about people's property values. You know, I feel for the gentleman next door to 503 Washington. If he went to sell, he's going to miss out on a lot of money just because the neighbor is that bad. You know, and that isn't right. That isn't fair. And the guy's been out of compliance for 10 years, and not just a little bit. So that's not. Hopefully it's nobody's house in here.
Well, and, I mean, realistically, the way that we use terms isn't the same. How we use the word annoyed in 1997 is not the same as the way we use annoyed now.
And what does repose mean, actually?
I know what angle of repose means, but
You know, I looked that up, but I can't remember what the definition was off the top of my head.
I mean, it sounds kind of like an old-fashioned sort of term.
angle of repose is like if you
That's,
pile sand up, it's gonna hit a certain angle.
Right.
But that's the angle of repose, and that's kind of a
yeah, but it's not that. I
universal
think it
thing.
means something
but
more like the
that's
comfort.
the angle of rest, I guess, but.
Yes, that's exactly what it is, a state of resting, tranquility, or calm. So the next portion of the nuisance definition is unlawfully interferes with, obstructs, or tends to obstruct or render dangerous for passage any square, street, alley, highway, or public park. So again, that's focused on public nuisances on public property, whereas it doesn't address Dave's issue of neighboring properties, private property. So theoretically, you could unlawfully interfere with your neighbor's passage, whether it's a street or whether it's, you know, blocking their fence, blocking their gate. That theoretically would not be considered a nuisance. And then the third one is in any way renders the public insecure in life or in use of property. So
That's kind of arbitrary, insecure, kind of in the eye of the beholder.
now the next section, which talks about designation, and one of the bad things about our code is these are dense paragraphs. There are other codes which I will show to you, which breaks it into smaller pieces and makes it a little more comfortable to read. But the following are declared nuisances affecting public health, peace, and safety. Accumulation of junk, debris, manure, rubbish, unattended growth or undergrowth, vegetation, that is higher than 2 feet upon property. So basically, your vegetation can be 2 feet before it is considered a nuisance.
And that says trees higher than 2 feet.
Yeah.
So,
Or across, hanging over the sidewalk, street, curb, parking, throwing or depositing or causing deposition in any street. So all those leaves that fall in the street and plug the gutter, that's all considered a nuisance. And then depositing in a public place, street or alley, garbage, printed matter, waste paper, refuse, or other offensive matter. And then then the keeping of public nuisance junk or materials, junk vehicles, parts thereof, automobile hulks, that create conditions that reduce the value of adjacent property owners, and how to define that. Become hiding places for rodents, breeding places for mosquitoes and insects, safety hazards for children, environmental hazards, which are a danger to soil, surface, or groundwaters, blights in the landscape, detrimental to the health, safety, of welfare, peace, and well-being of the general public. Therefore, the purpose and intent of this chapter is to regulate the proliferation of junk vehicles and declare junk vehicles a public nuisance. So it specifically lays out that as junk vehicles as a public nuisance. And then, of course, the question of defining what's a junk vehicle is subjective.
actually, doesn't it do that?
Later on, yep, so we'll get to that. And I think that's coming. So of all the other things it talks about up here, then it talks about that it names that as a specific nuisance, where it doesn't name some of the other stuff on this list as specific nuisances. So any kind of questions about the designated nuisance so far?
No, so far, no. I'm not there.
Okay. We won't skip that one. Okay. So one of the options that our code does allow us, and that is the city can arbitrarily take action to abate an issue, and typically abatement is where the city takes it upon themselves to fix that violation. So let's say it's a safety issue, like a tree that's leaning over a sidewalk at head height and it's going to hurt somebody. The city can go onto a property and cut that limb or tree down, and then the cost for that abatement would become the responsibility of the homeowner to repay the city. But there are certain steps you have to go through, and it could potentially require you to go to court before you could abate an emergency. So that's what that section covers. And I don't know that we need to necessarily go into that, because we're going to talk about some other jurisdictions that do it better. So I'd rather that be a constructive conversation than tearing down the problems in ours. Abatement by police. So this might be an example of if there was an animal that was biting people, the police can take action in some cases, but they have to use due care to make sure that they're offering assistance. Abatement liability of costs. This is what I mentioned before, that we can charge on. So if we do decide to take down a tree, or a tree is lying in the street, if Public Works cuts it up, we can charge the person who the tree fell off their property for that abatement and disposal cost and the cleanup cost. That would be a liability for the person who didn't maintain the tree and from whose property it came from. So that's that section. And then this section, I think we'll get to that. So some of the cities that I compared our code to is, so I looked at Clark County because I am familiar with this one, and the first section talks about nuisances, and it actually has several sections for defining what a nuisance is, depending on where you live. So in the rural area, which is ag and forest resource and rural centers, rural properties, they have one section. I didn't bother getting into that one because we don't have any rural conditions here. These are the sections for their urban classifications, and they have some standards which talk about the accumulation of more than 1 cubic yard of waste, rubbish, or trash, including but not limited to those certain types of things. And this is really good because it gives us a specific amount. It's not asking us to decide what is, you know, too much rubbish and junk in their yard. It's very specific. So I can stand in the street and say, yeah, that box looks like it's 1 square feet and there's a pile of 10 of them. That's more than a cubic yard of material, whether it's piled of, you know, yard debris or whether it's a pile of construction debris. We can measure that.
How much is a cubic yard?
3 by
What's-
3 by 3.
Yep, and then it goes on to identify such situations. So just because you have junk in your backyard doesn't necessarily mean it's a nuisance. So it goes on to clarify that as if it's visible from an adjacent property or public road, or road in this case, but typically it's a public road, unless it's covered waste receptacles, then that kind of lays some additional parameters. So just because your neighbor can stand on their roof and see it doesn't necessarily mean it's a nuisance. Traditionally, the standard is if it can be seen under normal circumstances. So even if there's a 6-foot fence, the fact that you can put your camera up 10 feet into the air and you can see over the backyard and that doesn't mean it's a nuisance. It has to be seen by someone with regular senses.
So that's a visual nuisance, though.
In a public place, yes. So there are ways that we can craft this which give us a lot more teeth, and it's enforceable. Because if someone drives by and take a picture of it, it's pretty hard to not argue, you know, if they took a picture from their car, that it is a visible nuisance and we can scale it out and identify it. And then, of course, the caveat is just because it's in their yard doesn't necessarily mean it's waste. If he's got a crate of power tools and he's working in the house, that's not necessarily means that it's just because the neighbor doesn't like the noise that all that construction material in the driveway or in the yard is a violation. So the next one is outside storage of abandoned, discarded, or unused objects or equipment, including but not limited to tires, furniture, stoves, refrigerators, and freezers that are visible from an adjacent property or road. Again, there's a parameter and it defines what you're looking at. And the one problem that I've had with this, and that is abandoned. Because if it's still in my yard, I haven't abandoned it. But it does have a little more direction there. An outside storage for more than 60 consecutive days or more of 5 cubic yards of any used or unused building materials which are visible from an adjacent property or road, provided that nothing herein shall, and then there's some, we'll get to this down below. But again, they're putting another wrap around, and that is if you're working on your house for more than 60 days, that same construction material can become a nuisance. Because if you're not making progress, and Erin Thoney has a case where there's a house across the street from one of her rentals, and he is moving at a glacial pace to get it fixed because he's doing it himself. It could be considered a nuisance if he was leaving his materials out in the yard. So this is another example of something that would be very effective for us. So That 60 consecutive days these are the caveats, provided or prohibit such storage when done in conjunction with construction project within a building permit which is being diligently pursued to completion, and prohibit storage upon a premises of a bona fide lumber yard. So theoretically, down there behind the oak tree, no matter how much you don't like looking at their pallets of wood, that would not be considered a nuisance. Or they make lawful any such storage when it is prohibited by other ordinances or law. So your neighbor cannot be storing fireworks until he has his fireworks stand on the 4th of July. So there are certain things you can't do. So the next one is the presence of an unattached vehicle or boat, so or inoperable vehicles or boats that have remained in the same location or on the same contiguously owned property for more than 30 consecutive days. Measurable, and you can observe that and document that. They are within the front, side, or rear yard that are visible from an adjacent property or roadway. And our code has some our zoning code has very specific language about where, like, boats and cars can be stored in the backyard. And so if you're not meeting those standards, this would apply. And provided that they meet the following criteria: the vehicle is missing a major component such as engine, battery, transmission, tires, U-joint, differential, suspension. So this, I like this section because it specifically talks about internal stuff. You can tell when a car has no fenders, but you know, if they can say, oh, it still runs, but it has no U-joints or differential or transmission, just because the engine runs doesn't mean it's not an abandoned car. Or if the boat has holes, visible damage that would substantially impair the boat's safe operations. So now we're getting into stuff that staff could actually identify potential problems, and it's abandoned if we can point to specifics.
Don't we have something similar to that now?
Not that I've seen. So the nuisance section that we were talking about before, it's kind of the generic stuff, but it doesn't have specific measurable details.
It doesn't have something for inoperable vehicles?
So we do, yep. But it's not in our nuisance section. So for us to be able to do code enforcement
So
on
what
it.
section's it in?
Well, so there is sections in the zoning, so it talks about where you can park in the zoning code in the individual zones, and there's also a parking section which defines parking, but it doesn't define it as a nuisance. It only says you can park in your rear yard under these cases. It doesn't give us the opportunity to say, well, when is parking in your backyard a nuisance? Our code doesn't really identify that. Whereas this would allow us to say, yes, you're parking in your backyard in accordance with the zoning, but at some point it becomes a nuisance and your neighbors want it to stop. So again, this is where I was getting at, and the idea that you can have boats and boats on trailers in your backyard. They can be stored in a consistent with the zoning, but in this case, in urban residential districts, the storage of a subsequent boat and trailer is limited to rear yard only. So this is further clarification in the what we currently have some of this language in our zoning code, but not our enforcement code. And then, so, and bearing in mind that not all of these would be applicable to us, and I pointed out that this is Clark County 5, 10, and 20 acre parcels, or they're Ag 40s or their Forest Resource 80s. So when you're talking parcels that big, that's kind of where some of these bigger boat issues, why they focus on that so much. So I don't know that we need to go over that or the farm machinery. So, but motor and RV vehicles parked in front yards on pervious surface. So that is not allowed. Our code is very specific also that you can park RVs on your property in the side or rear yard, and whether or not we want to talk about pervious surfacing, this may be something that comes up. Truck tractors and semi trucks, we don't have anything like that in our code.
We have to have that in our code. We outlawed the log trucks in Woodland 40 years ago, and there's been other code enforcement things where a guy had like a private contract fire truck that he wasn't allowed to park in front of his house. We've got that in our code someplace. We also define junk vehicles in Chapter 8, and we define junk in Chapter 8. And, you know.
Okay, we'll have to go back and take a look at that. Yeah. I'm trying to remember whether I didn't put all of Chapter 8 in this file. And then there is another section which talks about all urban and rural zoning classifications. And this might be something that we want to explore, and that is putting garbage and dumpsters on the street for more than 48 hours and limitations on that. And then the next one down below it is one of Sergeant Lip's favorite complaints, and that is basketball hoops stored on public sidewalks and streets.
We already have something for the basketball hoops, and I think getting into people's garbage can locations is cutting a little deep. Personally, I've seen cities where they can't be visible from the road after garbage day and stuff, but it's kind of like that guy that said you can't park your boat. You have to put a fence in front of it, and then he could put a picture of his boat on the fence. A person could put a picture of their garbage cans on the fence, but the garbage cans had to be behind the fence. It was.
Saying they don't want them on the road or the
Yeah,
sidewalk.
well, I understand, but it's just, I don't know, it seems like it's kind of, we have to remember we got to put some code through that's going to get approved and not going to get hung up over something. So I wanted to jump in there for a second, because our code says, just to share with everybody, that any law enforcement officer of the city may inspect and certify that a vehicle meets the requirements of a junk vehicle, or that debris is in fact junk. Bretta's hiding behind a wall again. That going to be part of our flow chart? Are they going to go along with this?
I want to make different flow charts for different types of enforcement cases.
And part of it is the police will not investigate civil complaints, but they will investigate misdemeanor complaints. So that's part of the reason why we need to clarify whether we're going to use the civil process or a criminal process, because right now there's this terrible mix, and if you call them something like a basketball hoop should be a civil complaint, but right now so theoretically as a civil issue it would fall to Public Works, or in this case the responsible official, which would be our code enforcement officer, as opposed to Sergeant Lip does it now, because it's his pet peeve and he's done it for as long as he's been here. It's something that he enforces, so he knows the code and he goes to talk to people and gets it fixed without Bretta always having to get involved.
I honestly feel like when you have these yards that there's several nuisances, but junk vehicles is one of them, if our police were to go there and tag the vehicle, is gonna have a lot more impact, you know, than sending city staff from the office to do that. I just to be brainstorming, that's just how I feel, and I don't know if we're gonna be able to incorporate some participation from the police or not. You know, I know everybody's busy, but it's all our cities, you know. We wanna make it all nice.
Yeah,
So,
and I know from experience that one of the issues that Clark County, how they address that, and that is if the vehicle is running, then it has to have valid tags, and then the police can get involved. But if it is not a running vehicle, then it falls under different rules under RCWs, because it could be considered a hulk or a junk vehicle, and it could be subject to tow, and whether or not they deal with that is a separate issue. So one thing that I pointed out, and that is that nuisance standard talks about whether or not a vehicle has missing parts that won't allow it to run. And I know that there are code enforcement officers in Clark County where they'll ride up and the guy sees him coming and he runs into his garage and grabs his battery, and he'll hook up each of the cars to that battery and show that each car can start and run. And technically there's nothing their code enforcement officer can do if they're all running.
I just, already see a whole bunch of that in our code. You know, when I look at chapter 8, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Kelso, I also looked at Kelso, and they have a specific definition section that's that has some interesting stuff in it. But they do not define junk. But they have a good list of more clear nuisances that are prohibited. So
Well, they use the International Property Maintenance Code.
that you referred to.
Yeah.
Yep. Junk vehicles, automobile hulks, and parts thereof, which is in accordance with a different chapter that they have available. And items that remain on the public right-of-way for a period of 48 hours. And in this case, it's more encompassing, that's not just their garbage cans. So Clark County Code was specific to like garbage cans and that kind of stuff in the right-of-way for 48 hours. Here they use 48 hours as a limit, but they don't necessarily limit it to junk and stuff that's left in the street. And then they have abatement of public nuisances. They have an enforcement section. And I went to look at Longview but didn't get a chance to. Now, I didn't get a chance to cut and paste it. La Center has a very specific junk section, which I thought was helpful because it includes very specific discussions of junk, unlawful storage, exemptions from this section, and penalties and violations. So they kind of have a hybrid junk and code enforcement section.
And what's their penalty?
I don't believe it's
Okay, person found guilty of violating the chapter not to exceed $300 and sentence not to exceed 30 days in jail.
yeah. So they have that section like ours do in section 1, which defines the penalty, and it just has $300. But again, it's a criminal process. And then this is their nuisances section, which talks about code, junk, litter. So it has specific definitions for individual nuisances. And then they do have this section, which I thought was helpful, and that is specifically kind of a definition of a duty to maintain. Nuisances affecting health. Nuisance affecting peace and safety. And then enforcement, which refers to a different chapter. But again, it's talking about a nuisance is a civil infraction subject to enforcement and prosecution, which is a criminal act to remedy criminal issues. So it's we don't consider code enforcement to be a prosecution, but so part of what I'm trying to show here when to answer Cliff's question of what exactly is the problem, and you want me to present a solution. Part of it is I need you to kind of direct me in the direction of what are your biggest concerns, what do you want me to start tackling, and I can email you these specific code sections and you can go through and circle the stuff you like and kind of tell me, okay, I like part A from this jurisdiction, part B from this jurisdiction, and if you can kind of identify the stuff that you do like and why, I can try and fit them all together into a Frankenstein of ours that is both specific and enforceable, but also fair and not draconian, sorry.
So, I think getting an email with, all of those different sections would be fine. I know we didn't completely go through our code, you know, because we've got, air emissions in section 17. We have, like, when a contractor's getting dirt all over the road, that's in 17, right? There's, you know, I think there's a lot of things that we need to address. If we're gonna address this, we need to address a lot of the problems we're having, right? And I don't know all the problems we're having either. I just know what I see or what bugs me or whatever, but we got I think Riley's trying hard to keep these contractors in check, but he doesn't have anything, you know, really backing him up on some of this stuff, and
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because there is no clear direct line between that, because for example, the erosion control ordinance, which is the tracking and leaving stuff on the roads, is in our streets and road and engineering design standards. So technically that falls under Riley, and code enforcement could do that because it's a development code, but in that case she would be responding to the public works director, not the community development director, and so, and that's why normally Riley is the one that gets pissed off, because he takes care of the streets and his guys are telling him how bad the road is, and he'll get mad and call the contractor directly rather than calling Bretta to call the contractor. So yeah, but if there was clear language in the code enforcement, then yeah, really the only option we would have in that case is we could rescind their grading permit, and that would be this, really the only punishment that we have, because that may or may not rise to the level of meeting a
So
nuisance complaint.
we have in our code, and you see it on the front of a lot of site plan permit applications and things, it says a washout area shall be built on a large lot subdivision or a large lot development. There shall be a washout for the trucks to drive through and wash the mud off their tires. And we're not even enforcing that that gets built when the project starts.
Well, under the stormwater and the erosion control standards, they can meet it through several different routes. And in some cases, a washout rack is required, and some cases it's not. And if it's not in the approved erosion control plan, then Riley has to threaten to withdraw their permits in order to get them to install it. But yeah, they're not always required, but in some cases they are.
And it seems like it's gotten worse over the years with the developers, because when the initial communities went in, which you weren't here for, but those developers like Aho, they were local, like they were families that were local, so they were living here, and they were gonna hear the complaints of their own neighbors
Mm-hmm.
and their own people that they know, their own friends, for the damage that they were doing, or the conditions they were creating, whereas we're having developers now that could care less. And, like, I know on Saturday, I went by the Sandlot, the Lewis River Road one, and they were out working, and it was after 9 o'clock on Saturday.
Yep.
And they weren't even done working, they were taking a break, sitting in the windowsills with floodlights on working, like they had no intention of quitting for the day.
Yeah.
And so, if we're not gonna there's no reason to have regulations if we're not going to enforce them.
So, yeah, I did receive a code enforcement complaint about that very place. And they did have photos, and so I could see what lot it was, and I looked up on the cloud permit and pulled up their permit application, saw who the applicant was, and sent them an email, CC'd Riley on it, and then Riley talked to him. So we are actively dealing with that.
Are there different developers for?
There are. You got DR Horton, and then you also have, they are selling like half of it or over half of it to individual builders. So, yeah. Yeah, but the best thing is I always tell people, send me a photo. That way I can build a case. And that's how we've been handling it. But yeah, I have received complaints, and that's how I look up their permit, see the applicant, CC Riley, and we talk to him.
And the gate just needs to be locked at
And
certain
you-
hour. You're not
and-
leaving, I guess.
Yeah, and you could theoretically call the police, and if they have time, they may drive by, but there's no guarantee that they're not out on other calls and doing other things. But yeah, in that case, we know about that, and we can send them a notice and order. We can fine them the $25. And if they keep doing it after we warn them, we could withdraw their permits or
Good.
cancel their permits.
So,
Can I say something real quick?
yes,
So the two complaints I've received, I contacted both of the builders, and that was just the first thing I said is, hey, listen, we've received a complaint, there are photos, proof that you are violating the city code and working past the normal construction hours. If we get one more complaint, I'm gonna revoke your building permits, and we're gonna have another conversation. And so far, it's worked, but that's usually what I just go straight to.
so, our code says that they shall have a washout or best 15, it's in chapter 15. Construction access route, construction vehicles shall be limited to specific access points. Access points shall include a temporary sedimentation pond or other approved BMP, some best management practices, right? So that other approved BMPs needs to be defined in some category, because you've got people out here with a broom. There's a difference between a street sweeper and a broom.
Yeah.
And they've got a broom trying to do the job of a street sweeper, and all they're doing is building up dirt on the shoulder, which is dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know, it seems like we'll do the bare minimum to appease and go on. And I always just question, why don't we just get the washout in and have it done? And you know, for all of those, Lewis River Road was sand dunes there for a little while this summer. But anyway, while we're looking at code, we should look at the weaknesses in the code like that. So,
And we did shut the sandlot down for not having riprap in. We shut them down for, it was a few days. They were not allowed to work until they got that washout in, so.
all right, Travis, we've interrupted you, but are we gonna just get read more code here, or have we got new meat and potatoes to talk about, or?
So that was the next question I had for you. So we can go over our enforcement provisions, which is kind of the written version of the flow chart. I don't know whether you want me to do that or not, or you want me to just leave that with you, or?
So
Right.
I think we need to probably, when we come back, see some flow chartage, but I was kind of wondering, does anybody have any ideas about the fine structure? You know, I don't know if this 1, 2, 3, 4 class thing is suitable, because I always think it's better if you have increasing fines would be a good incentive, you know, but we can't really say, well, if you let this go for a month, it goes from a 4 to a 3, or then a 3 to a 2, right? That doesn't, not that logical, right?
Why
But
not?
because we're using that same number to classify, you know, penalties for different violations, right? So we don't wanna, but we could say that a 1 starts at $25 and goes to $50 in 30 days and $75 in 60 days, right? Is that, I mean, I'm throwing out ideas.
Yeah. So is it really useful to have 4 different levels?
Talk, Greta, talk.
I would rather just have a basic outline of, for nuisances, it's this. You don't pay it within 30 days or comply, it's gonna double your fines. Something to that type of wording, just rather than all this class 1, nobody knows what that is. And so if we just break it down for nuisances, your fine is this, whatever. That's just kind of that's
mean,
how I would like it.
I can see to a certain extent, you know, when you mentioned like offense, that's not as big of a deal as some other sorts of nuisances.
Exactly, they are different. Every case is different, and so I feel like if we do the class 1 class, that really limits us on, I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but it's confusing.
I guess for me, like, the only thing that I would differentiate is whether you're looking at businesses or personal property, and as well as
Exactly.
whether it's just a nuisance or if it's a safety issue.
Correct.
Like a safety issue should have a bigger
Exactly.
bite to it.
And I'd like a outline or definition of what is class 1. What falls under the category of class 1. You know, I want to see an outline of, but I can't find one anywhere. So I'd like to work on that.
The only one I know of in the code is the marijuana code, specifically says class 1.
should we, so these things that are in chapters 15 and 17 and other places, you know, should we, if they're like a nuisance, should we just define them in our nuisances as well? Maybe not even take them out of where they're at, but, you know, just make sure they're included up in the nuisance, you know, cause that's, we've got penalties in different sections and all kinds of things in different sections, but the administrative, development administrative stuff really could be on its own, and that's really mostly all gonna be commercial, other than the guy that builds a garage at his house without a permit, right? But, I'm trying to figure out how to keep it simple in the same token. And then animals falls in that too, doesn't it? Don't we have,
Animals. Does
no?
it? I want to say animals are in the police department, the police section.
The only animal stuff is like noise, barking, and that's in nuisances. So it does fall in code enforcement nuisances for animals barking. That's pretty much the only thing it talks about animals.
So, just do you think there's even a reason to start at $25? You know, as far as the level of fines, should at least the minimum be 50?
25 doesn't seem like very much, really.
I will say from, because I pulled other jurisdictions' wording and policies, and all of them started at 50, their fee schedule for violations, and they were smart and had their wording to say civil penalty rather than civil infraction. And so, but every fee schedule that I looked at for penalties all started at $50.
And there is a definition of nuisance animals, but it's enforced by the police department.
Let's that's, even if we don't keep the 1, 2, 3, 4 scale, let's at least start that at 50 and you know, propose to at least have those numbers all be proportionate to that, don't you guys think? That's, I mean, that's not, it's better. It's not like it's ungodly, but it's better, right?
Well, I would take off the maximum as well.
Yeah.
Especially if we're talking about things that are going on with businesses.
I think when we go back to our flow charts, we're gonna, try to define more about, you know, when it needs to go to the next level. When we've exhausted all of our stuff, where's it gonna go and how?
I'll put together some ideas of flowcharts, send them to you guys, and you give me feedback, and we'll go from there. Does that sound
Okay.
good?
So I guess the question, with the Lewis River development, if they have multiple builders going on in there, like when you're talking about the people like bringing contaminants onto the road, like how do you prove which development is the one causing it?
You know, in the beginning, from experience, when you build a subdivision, the main excavation people are the ones that drag stuff out on the road. Once you have the individual lots, you know, I don't know how much it happens anymore. They used to sell those neighborhoods to builders, like 5 lot blocks, right? And guys that build spec homes, those guys don't drag dirt out of the neighborhood. It's just the initial, and only exception to that is if they phased it and they started in the front and then they're going to the back. But it's still the dirt guy that is the culprit in all that. The other guys, you know, it's minimum once they get the site prep. You know, that's really not as far as for the debris on, you know, the dirt on the road, sand and mud and softball-sized rocks and all the things we've seen lately. So, but I think we should make that a nuisance.
Cliff, I have a question for you. You brought up the issue of the problem and the solution. Where do you see the balance between being property code Nazis versus working with people and trying to get, you know, effective postcards that gets people to want to be good neighbors without having to drop the hammer on them? Where do we draw the line between being Nazis and versus milquetoast?
I don't know, I've really given that a lot of thought. I think, I don't think we should push too hard. And I like Greta's idea of giving them a call and, just trying to work with them. And I think you'll find most people will work with us. And the ones that don't, slam them, you know? I mean, if you don't do that, you just got a runaway city. And once people find out that they can do it and not get chastised for it, they just keep doing it. And other people, so I like, Brenda's got a good idea, just keep doing that.
I like that slam 'em. I agree. Like you say, 90 whatever percent of people comply once they get, you know, sometimes we all need to be put up on our toes a little, right? But there are the obnoxious few. This isn't, you know, and I'm going to encourage when it's a situation, because you go look at them, right? And when it's a situation of we need to get this person help by Make a Difference Day or the Boy Scouts or something like that, I'm in favor of that too. I'm gonna reach out to Habitat for Humanity and see if they have any. I haven't seen where Habitat's done anything in Woodland, and there's a Habitat for Humanity of Cowlitz County, you know, and maybe we can find that this place is a candidate. You know, there might be some resources there. I understand this person isn't returning any of your requests, you know, they're not answering the mail, but I think, you know, maybe if somebody got a hold of them and said, hey, you know, there's more alternatives than to just get letters from the city on this, and it can't stay like this forever. But obviously, and that's not your guys' job to reach out to Habitat, but those things should happen too. So you guys have good enough direction that we can workshop the other three real quick?
Because I'm with Cliff, like, I'm not trying to go after the people who are, like, just like an elderly person struggling to
Right.
maintain their property or something like that. But there's people who could care less, and unless you do something, yeah, because, I mean, like, my neighbor who had weddings every weekend in
Yeah.
residential, like, she couldn't care if she was making $7,000-8,000 a weekend, but what's she gonna care if she gets fined $25? While
Yeah.
they're parking blocking my driveway as well as
Mm.
the noise and everything else. Yeah, I mean, it makes it unbearable, like, and if there's nothing you can do about it, then, like,
I have the, Princess Castle, whatever the hell the thing is. Empress, up the road from me, and when you can tell when there's a wedding, because they're going up and down that road at 100 mile an hour, they're making liquor runs, you know, during the reception, and it's crazy, it's annoying. So, I think, we're not gonna build Rome in a day, but I think that's a great start, good conversation, and, we can touch on these other things. Some of these things are real quickies, and talk about them. And item B. We'll move on to item B. Workshop item B. Is that what you're looking for? Well, I know C and D are quickies. This one shouldn't be too long. So, go ahead, Travis. You want to staff report us there on?
So normally, like last time, you covered these.
So you want me to staff report these? So, okay, so, if you want me to do that, this is Senate Bill 5290, which, the state has said we have to be faster about, there's deadlines for how long we can review a project that before it goes. And what's the difference in numbers from 120 days to, one of the simple ones was 65 days, right?
Yep.
And do we have that coded, our time limits in code?
We have time limits spread all over our code. And
Okay.
to be honest, my preference would be to just search the entire code and recategorize it and reorganize it, but we don't really have the time for that. But really, my professional opinion is there's 4 kinds of codes in existence. There is process-related codes, and they tell you how to do step by step, how long you have to do. There are physical development codes, like our highway commercial district has a section about architectural standards and how much parking you have to have, how much glass you have to have, how many signs you can have. Those are all physical standards. Then there's also the set of qualification standards, which is like what your setbacks would be, or sorry, what types of uses a development can have. So whether a use is permitted or not, or whether it's a conditional use, those are use-related standards. And so really the most logical way for us to organize our code would be to divide them into, and then, sorry, the last one is enforcement-related issues. So ideally what we would do is we would look into the code, and the code enforcement section talks about you have X amount of fines after X amount of days. To me, that's a process, and we should not be treating, you know, a $300 maximum of 30 days in jail shouldn't be in the individual codes. It should be in the process, and the enforcement process section should be separate. So that way the code would be a lot more organized, and Clark County is a great example because they reorganized their entire code when I was there in 2000, and they have one process for a type 1, a second process for a type 2. Those are administrative approvals. A type 3 goes to the hearings examiner, and a type 4 is a legislative decision that goes to the Planning Commission and the Council. And there are no cases where you're treating one application under one timeline and one process, and an identical in a different neighborhood, under a different zoning, under a different timeline or a different process. So it's a lot more structured, and whether you're doing a 2-lot subdivision or a 100-lot subdivision, the process is exactly the same. So ideally, we would find all of those permitting things and put them into a single section because they're all over. How we address this in Woodland is I never take 60 days. If an application comes in, we try and get it out the door or get to a public hearing within 45 days. Because there's actually a code section which talks about, there's a state law, and this is the state law that says an applicant is entitled to a 20% refund if we go over the time limit. So,
But here's my question. Do we have to codify our time limits? Do we regulate our time limits on ourselves in our code?
we do, and
we-
we do not have to because it's in the RCW, but typically
But
it is
so how
typical.
many places do we actually say we're gonna do this within so many days?
It's all over.
Is it? Okay.
It's in the chapter 15 for the critical areas, it's in chapter 14 for the building code, and it's in chapter 19 and 18 for land use.
So is there a reason not to just go by the RCW if you're, like, if that's your outer limit anyway, but we meet it? Like, is there a reason to not just use the RCW or something like that?
We could, and typically we just adopt this state standard in our code. But that's just the way it's always been done. It doesn't mean it.
I know we've had these matrix that say if this is this kind of permit, whether it needs SEPA or not, and all these things, and then, you know, this is what decision it is, but I never, remember it saying that we had time limits. I know we talk, I hate those matrix. For one reason is because you never have the headers where you need them. The key is gone, and you're looking at this, and you have to scroll back. So there's no time limits in those matrix, just,
Not in this one, and it doesn't define the type of permit, because the type of permit is in RCW, and it's in our process code, but it's not in this matrix. But this is the one you're talking about, and I'll slide down. So like a boundary line adjustment. This column is for Public Works Director. This is for Community Development Director and the Development Review Committee. So these are administrative decisions that are made by staff. And then, so this is a type 1, a type 2, and then hearings examiner is a type 3, and then these are type 4, but it doesn't say that on this chart. So for example, a critical area permit, like a wetland permit, the decision is made by the Development Review Committee, and I sign the document, and an appeal at an open record hearing before the hearings examiner is a type 3 process. So this tells us who has authorization to approve it, but the actual timing is down here in the site plan review section. So for site plans, it talks about review types and how long you have, how many days, how to categorize, how to define the process, and how long you have to process it.
just without going to the, how many other places is it?
Okay, so
Just,
yeah, there's the SEPA checklist is in chapter 15. The critical area permits are in different sections of chapter 15. The building permits are in chapter 14. And the engineering review is in chapter 13 and 12, which is the roads and infrastructure sections.
and all of those things have been addressed in 5290 that have, I thought it was just, you know, site plan approvals and things of that nature.
So
From what I read, I
that is correct. It talks about process type 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, and our code is not necessarily directly. Now, the site plan section here talks about 1 and 2, but the subdivision section, Title 16, has its own timelines. I forgot to mention that, but it doesn't say whether it's a type 1 or whether it's a type 2 or a 3.
Are any of these numbers the same as what we have now?
I think a couple of them are actually longer.
Okay. So,
And I think we would be okay if we don't adopt this code, because the ones that are faster, it's not a violation to be faster.
yeah.
It would just be nice to have them all in the same place.
They want us to have this code so we can get grant money, right? And this is from when?
Let's see.
2022? No, 5818 was from 2022.
Yes, so this one is already in effect.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, we should have, to make commerce happy, we should update our code by June, the end of June. But really, we are not at any risk because it's one of those default, it already applies to us. And to this day, if somebody wanted to ask for a 20% refund, we would have to give it to them under RCW, even though it's not in our code.
Okay.
So this might be a giant Chinese fire drill without a lot of,
So I have one concern for the public on this. I don't remember. I mean, you'll know the RCW, but there's one RCW that says builders can do a combined notice, and we've had, you know, I've called the city out on 2 or 3 occasions where they've done a public notice on something and not contacted adjacent property owners because it falls under the combined permitting procedure that's allowed in RCW of whatever, right?
Mhm.
But they're doing SEPA as part of that, and SEPA says that we will notify, you know, I think it's very important that we notify, that our notification stuff is, you know, not just the adjoining properties, because the state code says neighboring properties. It doesn't say shared property lines, it says neighboring properties. If we're gonna dive into this, I'd like to see us make sure that we always notify an area, and that we also maybe set that at within 500 feet or 1,000 feet. Is it the burden to do that on the builder?
and in recent, I think it was, I want to say 2023, we now require notice to be mailed within 300 feet.
300
So we
feet.
have fixed that. And typically 300 for urban areas and it's 500 for rural areas.
Okay, well,
So,
then, let's talk about item C. Anybody have any questions on that at all?
I get why they're doing it, because there's places like up in Seattle, like if you need to replace your roof, it's a 5-year permit process to get that done. Like, you gotta know 5 years ahead of time, you need to replace your roof.
Is that because of environmental stuff, or, I mean, why would it?
And just because they're backlogged as well.
there's a lot of reasons for that. If you're familiar with Cleellum, they just declared bankruptcy because the city refused to issue building permits under an approved land use application. The applicant sued them, and basically drove the city into bankruptcy.
Wow.
Millions of dollars of settlement, and they're basically cutting all their services and staff. Yeah.
All of these would go together if we ever did do this updates, but, so item C.
So this one, actually, I will do this one real quick for you. There are design review language for ADUs, but the language that's coming to you for the next meeting that you discussed last meeting, we took those standards out, so that's no longer applicable. And we do not necessarily need to worry about this simply because the city of Woodland does not have residential design review. If you want to start imposing design standards on residential developments, we could undertake that process, but luckily this bill, which we have to comply with, we will not have to make any changes to our code because we do not have a residential design standard. And once we fix the ADUs, our code will be compliant because ADUs cannot have design review on them.
Oh, that was the rule, that no design review at all, not just streamlined, but none at all?
Well, so you can't apply regulations to ADUs that don't apply to the primary house. So if you want to regulate ADUs, you have to start regulating single-family homes. And for example, like if you're familiar with Leavenworth, Washington, it's kind of this Bavarian town, and they require all kinds of Bavarian whirligigs on their roof lines.
You should see Oysterville.
And it's beautiful, but it's
Yeah.
also very expensive and a pain in the neck to administer.
Oysterville wants you to match the period, like 1890s or something. No, but lots of wood, lots of batten board and certain kind of fences and. All right, so we don't have to do anything there.
Yep, so this will never come back to you unless you want to engage in that.
Nope, we're good. All right, so then Cliff's item D.
Okay, so this bill is intended to make the permitting process for residential units more efficient. And so it involves increasing our SEPA exemptions so that we have less paperwork. And SEPA is the State Environmental Policy Act. It is essentially a 1971 law that was one of the first environmental codes adopted in Washington State and literally across the country. And the purpose of it was, it's kind of an umbrella regulation that covers the built and the natural environment. And it's designed to take a look for significant adverse environmental impacts which will negatively affect the community. And back in 1971, when it was originally adopted, it was kind of the groundbreaking environmental protection law. And since then, environmental protection laws have kind of matured. And so there are a lot of other regulations like Fish and Wildlife, Department of Ecology, Habitat, Wetlands, Ordinances, Shoreline. And so this is kind of a 1971 tool that's a paperwork drill 99.9% of the time, and the state recognizes that there's not a lot of functionality in it and that communities can cut that paperwork out of the process. We charge $750, and it's a paperwork drill that I have to enter on the state's SEPA website, and notice goes out to the neighbors, and it's a different notice standard than what we originally had in our code. So it's basically a 1970s mandate that was out of date in the 90s, and we're still implementing it. So this code is already in effect, so the state law could apply, and applicants could request a SEPA waiver under certain circumstances. We just never see that because we don't have a lot of land use applications. So this is another one where we should clean up our code just for the sake of it makes sense to clean it up.
What would we do?
So, for example, a subdivision requires a SEPA checklist, but a short plat does not. And a plat is basically a division of property on paper. And our code says you can create up to 4 lots without doing the environmental review. And state law says you can do up to 9 lots without that paperwork drill. Now, the state law already says 9, but we still say 4. We could change our code to 4, and what we would get is a cost savings to the developer, but we would essentially get the same product with a cheaper process and a faster process.
Do we have to change it?
You do not. I can bring you the chart that shows you can go up to like 35 apartments. You can go up to 9
we're not
single
required to.
family lots. No. Ours are currently set at the minimum to incur as much bureaucracy as we can.
Let's see the chart. Let's see the chart next month.
Yeah.
I actually, back, just kind of for public information. SEPA is part of public information.
Yep.
And I want to protect as much public information going out as possible. We have people all the time that claim that, nothing was done and here's all this stuff, and when, the planning and everything went on, the reports happened, everything happened for years. So I'm all for public information, but I'm all for affordable housing. So if we could see the chart next month,
Sure.
let's see that.
Sure. And actually today was a great example because we did a pre-application for a drive-in car wash, and they have 20 vacuum stations, and 20 parking spaces is one of the triggers for environmental review. So the fact that this high efficiency water reclamation fancy car wash has to do an environmental review because there's 20 parking spaces for vacuums triggers this SEPA review. So
But didn't you just say that the reason why we have the notification for building within, if that you have to notify within neighbors within 300 feet was falling under SEPA? So if you take away the SEPA, then you also take away that.
So we've changed our code, and our code, any site plan or subdivision now requires notice. So some applications require 2 notice instead of 1.
I'd like to make sure before we decide, I would wanna know, because I know from some of the hearings that I've listened to and been a part of, some of the regulations were triggered, or they had to make changes that were beneficial to the community because of SEPA.
Yep. There are a few cases, and essentially the SEPA process has the result of the environmental process is either a determination of non-significance, meaning there's no significant adverse impacts, or there is a determination of significance, in which case they do an environmental study. It's kind of like our Exit 21 2-year process for affecting or for the impacts of Exit 21 improvements to salmon in the Lewis River. It's like a giant $1 billion environmental document. Those very rarely happen. and then the other option is a mitigated determination of non-significance. So we recently had a case in Cowlitz County where Granite Asphalt and Construction was doing a project out on the Columbia River, and they're moving their asphalt plant out there, and we sent Cowlitz County a letter basically saying we are concerned about the amount of traffic that's going to go through exit 22. It is going to cause significant adverse impacts to exit 22, and Granite. So we asked Cowlitz County to apply mitigation or to do an environmental impact study that would look at that intersection. And Granite called us and they said, okay, you know, what can we do? How do we fix this problem? And they agreed to mitigate their impacts by giving us $50,000 worth of money to do additional study on exit 22. And they're giving us $50,000 to make improvements to the street at Horseshoe Lake. So they're donating materials for a construction project for the community, and they're paying for additional design and study at exit 22. So in that case, our code doesn't allow us to require that, but they can volunteer to mitigate for their impacts. So that's an example of how we can work outside of the code, but we don't need $1 million study. Instead, we're getting $100,000 of actual improvements to our transportation system.
Well, I mean, it helps with the design process or the study of it, but not necessarily fixing it.
And then sometimes the SEPA is a big factor in the conditions when you apply conditions to an approval.
No.
No?
No, we always use the code. So the meat and potatoes of our commercial and industrial is in the site plan standards, and we don't use SEPA because we have site plan standards. And in subdivisions, typically the big subdivisions for, in our case, 5 lots or more, has to do a SEPA checklist. And the new standards that this is talking about would up that to 9. And we haven't, since I've been here, we haven't had any 9 lots. We've had 150, 39, and 87 in the landing. So they all will have to do an environmental study anyways. And the apartment complexes, we've had 2 apartment complexes, one on 5th, one behind the corner store. They're going to have to do and they did an environmental checklist anyways. This wouldn't change that. It's only the really small projects for, you know, the small developers and the guys just getting started. They're really the only ones that are affected by this.
Although I don't know if I would want to take it out until we know whether Cowlitz County also is prepared to force us to annex land in. Because that may come in the north plan.
Okay.
When you have people, when you're taking in land that, you know, that are 5 acres right now or 2.5 acres right now. And
Yeah. So I will bring that matrix for you for the next meeting.
Next month, we will have public hearings on, we were supposed to have some public hearings on the stuff we did this month, but they couldn't get published in time. So that's why we're not having public hearings tonight, but, it is what it is. Travis had a busy month, and February being a short month, but I wanna say, spent their $2,500 application fee and asked for basically code revisions, you know, and, our city council has a good heart, and I think that's great, but, we do have, one of the things about that causes us to be reactive, and actually increases the workload, you know, in my opinion. But because of that, next month we'll have our public hearings, and, on our, childcare stuff and all the other stuff.
ADUs.
ADU stuff, and, we'll look at these matrices.
I thought that the state law was that you can't go to, like, it was per 10,000 of population.
Travis could define that for you. There's like a caveat in there that says the city can, and then there's some social justice permitting deal or something. It was just important in order to be able to lay it down, to put it in front of city council, the city council say, only one permit in our town, even though there isn't 10,000, everything is, it was a big deal. That was a good thing. That was a good.
There's a safety valve that allows jurisdictions to invite more businesses into their community. But that is a local jurisdiction driven request. And part of my concern is the way Washington State does these is they go into effect if cities don't do something. And I think this will be the next one that comes down the pipe as even if you don't want it, you will now start accommodating stores because there's just too many small communities that are standing by their morals and standing their ground. And at some point, I think the state won't like that anymore and take that decision out of your hands.
You said something about a meeting with the council in April?
Yeah, the mayor hasn't sent you guys an invitation yet? No?
What's the date for that? Do we know?
I want to.
Better not make it, no. I had a meeting with the council last Monday,
I want to say April 25th.
April 25th.
Does that sound right?
Yeah.
That's a Saturday.
You don't work on, so, the RCWs, the state RCWs say that the, planning commission and the city council in our type of government will meet once a year to just talk about things. Well, also, the city council generally has a retreat where they talk about their goals and policies for the year once a year. The mayors combine those, that's my understanding. There's gonna be a presentation about 100 Davidson, and there's, gonna be, I don't know what, some icebreaker stuff and everything, but it's a chance for us to meet the city council and hopefully have some conversations and kind of explain to them the things we are working on, we have accomplished, and get some direction from them. Most of the time when somebody runs for city council, growth is a subject in their campaign. They talk about what they're going to do about growth or traffic or things of that nature in every campaign. So it'd be interesting to see what they have to say and what their views are on some things. Otherwise, now that our comp plan's done, it's kind of the mundane code writing stuff for a little while. But you're not available April 25th. You're not mandatory to be there. Well, I hope it will be recorded. Will it be recorded and it can be watched later? Don't know. But
I'm not sure. I'm just showing up like you. Yeah,
a little disappointed that they didn't get the same email I got,
Oh, yeah.
you know.
And I don't know whether he sent it to everybody or whether he just sent it to you as the chair, just for you to coordinate. Cause I don't think I didn't get the email either, so if I had more info, I would give it to you. And I was just gonna crack a joke about it's marijuana, and now that marijuana has been passed, I'm not sure what everybody's campaign promise is now.
You know, you're right. A lot of it this time was marijuana, but it always, you know,
Traffic.
Maybe because
Sharon was nodding her head. She's seen it all too.
So-
Used to be, you could tell the election cycles. You would have people that were never at planning commission meetings, all of a sudden at planning commission meetings, because they're running for office. And the ones that slay me is the ones that don't come to planning commission meetings, but all of a sudden know it all about how the city should be
Of course.
planned. You know,
So, what are we talking about, like 9 o'clock in the morning, or?
something like that. 10,
I
9.
would say it's like 4 hours.
Yeah. It was in the morning. Lunch, I think lunch would be
Are we
served.
getting lunch? Okay.
I might put myself on the hook for lunch there. But I'll buy anybody from the planning commission lunch if the city don't buy lunch. Will it?
Get for Costco hot dogs.
Cafe 150.
Did you guys get the agenda emailed to you? You didn't look?
Yeah,
You did?
I can't get on the email.
well, I
emailed
Called
you.
Amanda about that?
I haven't heard back from you since I emailed.
Well,
I just get it off the,
no, I get it to
I-
my personal email, you know?
yeah.
Yeah,
You got yeah. I still haven't got it.
right, but the agenda, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I get it, you know, I approve the agenda for them to, but I like to see that everybody, you know, like, if it was an email to everybody, here's the agenda, then I'd know everybody got the agenda, and I don't know why, I would sleep better if I knew everybody got sent the agenda.
it's nice because it's a process to get to the agendas, like, so it'd be nice to just have the link to
It
just get
is,
into it, but.
it is not a web designer's link, without a doubt. It's, you wouldn't have a website like that to make money. Well, I asked Travis tonight to, the city website has a drop-down menu of different departments and this and that, and there's one for our code. You know, if you go to the one, he's doing it now, go to resources and forms, there's Woodland Code. And I'm had to have him put a link, I've asked him to put a link to our comprehensive plan right there with that. So that people, when they're talking about how we've never planned anything, they can go right there and see, we have, I have 4 or 5 comprehensive plans at home, I've been here so long. So, anyway, and our comprehensive plan will come, it'll come in handy when we're down the road and there's land use applications that we do review and stuff, because that's where we're gonna go and look for our findings for yes or our findings for no. And, that's what we use, and that's what we use to say, yes, this goes with what we believed when we wrote our plan, you know, so I'm glad it's gonna be on that list. That'll be wonderful.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So, now that the meeting's over, I did go back over our rules, and the chair does vote. And, it used to be that the chair didn't vote, the chair only broke a tie. So, from now on, I will vote, for what that's worth.
You're gonna have to commit yourself.
I'm gonna have to commit myself. missed the public not on the agenda speaking stuff. I was hoping you would have some, thanks, Cliff.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd have something to say.